Today I have Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes with me. And Andrew, you do many things in the world, including you're a pastor of a church. You also obviously have received your doctorate. Did you get your doctorate at Princeton? Is that where you did your doctorate?
Great question. So I did my MDiv at Princeton
Oh,
Seminary
you did.
and
Okay.
did my PhD in political science, actually, at the CUNY
Oh,
Grad Center in New York.
cool. Great. Wonderful. Well, so there's lots of things that you do in the world, including one of those things is you just have wrote a book called Plenty Good Room, Co-Creating an Economy Enough for All. Super excited to chat more about it. It really, the title doesn't quite give it away, but this book really is a lot about like the Black radical tradition and the Black Christian socialist tradition as well. And so we'll dive into all of that. But before we do, who is Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes to Reverend Dr. Andrew Wilkes?
My goodness. Well, first, I am someone who is appreciative of the work of careful, well done pedagogy, which is to say, I appreciate making the work that you do on a
Oh, thank you.
people's theology. And it's a joy to be with you for this conversation. Who am I to me? I think that's an ever evolving question and thus response. So, what I'll say today is I am someone who wants to use inquiry and inventiveness to try to figure out how we can devise a world other than, and here the language of Dorothy Day comes to mind, this
Mm,
rotten system we've been accustomed to accept.
mm, mm. Beautiful. Well, I already know that you're the perfect guest for People's Theology. If you're starting to throw out Dorothy Day quotes right at the beginning of the podcast, you're the kind of person that needs to be on this podcast. So super stoked to chat more with you. So I really want to make this episode kind of a primer or introduction to a lot of people that might not know what the Black radical tradition is, and specifically, really, the Black Christian socialist tradition. And so I really want this to be as introductory as possible for folks to
Yeah.
just kind of get a sense of like what's the history around this. A lot of the people that listen to this podcast, including myself, many of us grew up in white evangelicalism. So we had no idea specifically of the Black radical tradition, and certainly not the Black Christian socialist tradition. And so, yeah, to know a little bit about the history of this, to learn more about the theology that's behind these traditions, and certainly even knowing some of the biblical stories that animate these traditions is, I think, really important. So before we dive into the theology and some of the biblical stories around this, I'd love to just kind of get a better sense of the history of the Black radical tradition. I myself have read a little bit of Cedric Robinson, and he has the groundbreaking book
Like
Black
Marxism. Yeah.
Marxism, and so I've read a little bit of that, and I've dived a little bit into some of the Black radicals, especially during the civil rights time. Fred Hampton and some others. But yeah, I'd love to just hear kind of whatever comes to mind right away when I ask the question, "What is the Black radical tradition?" I'd love to just hear whatever comes to mind right away for you.
Yeah, first, really appreciate that question. The Black radical tradition has a couple of figures who are commonly associated with it. Um, One is Cedric Robinson. The text Mason mentioned, Black Marxism, the makings of the Black radical tradition, comes to mind. Robin D.G. Kelly, a historian out of UCLA, has a well regarded text called Freedom Dreams. And the subtitle has the Black radical imagination or tradition on there in some regards. And his work, in some ways, directly inspires the second chapter of Plenty Good Room. But in addition to folks like Robinson and Robin D.G. Kelly, um, Claudia Vera Jones is one of my great heroes and inspirations. Claudia Vera Jones is a Trinidadian born Marxist, um, whose burial grounds, as it turns out, literally happened to be to the left of Karl Marx in the Highgate Cemetery. And there's a
Wow.
famous biography named after Vera Jones. And I mentioned that in a specifically Christian context because I think a cloud of witnesses for people who are trying to turn the world upside down for justice is too thin, too insubstantial a cloud if we're only naming Christian figures.
Hmm.
the work for justice and doing what we regard as equitable, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God, to invoke a triad from the prophet Micah, I think extends to those who are deeply human and who are trying to make a world that is rooted in abundance and sufficiency rather than social conditions of domination,
Hmm.
exploitation, extraction, and all the rest.
Hmm. So one of the questions that often comes up, and I remember when I first started deconstructing, and I'm starting to think about politics differently. I grew up super conservative, and so I thought about politics in that way.
Yeah.
And then I started deconstructing, and that's when I like learned that wait, you can be a liberal and being a Christian. And then I realized a little later, I started diving into more liberation theology and all of that, and I realized, oh wait, like the liberal this liberalism that I'm now sort of encountering and was life changing for me at a time, I'm realizing it wasn't far enough. Like it didn't go far enough. And so, and that would have been around the time, I think Obama still would have been president when I was first starting to deconstruct. So I just sort of assume, well, I guess if someone is a person of color, if they're black, then that sort of you just as a white person growing up, I just would have assumed, oh, like they all think the same, they all vote Democrat or whatever. And then I realized, wait, no, there's so many different layers to like how people have thought about politics and about the world. And so, yeah, I'm really curious just like how maybe the black radical tradition differentiates from especially like a lot of neoliberalism, regardless of if that neoliberal is a black person or white or whoever.
It's a really great question. And appreciate the opportunity to maybe elaborate a bit further. I think a part of what differentiates the Black radical tradition and its many varieties from a Black liberal tradition or traditions that are communitarian of varying sorts is a few things. One is an anti-imperial, counter-empire sort of stance. I think
Mm,
we see this in folks like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who has popularized language around abolitionism and is a famed American studies scholar in terms of disciplinary contributions. In addition to the anti imperial stance, I think there's a deep sense that not just anti capitalist discontent, but also the move to create a differently arranged society.
mm,
And there is a tradition of autonomous politics that includes anarchists and folks like William Anderson, who has a text, The Nation on No Map, those who essentially view mutual aid and power as something that can be shared with, rather than top down power and centralized concentrations of a small group of folks making decisions for the rest of us. And so, whether it's a strong party politics tradition or strong community control, we can share resources together in a cooperative kind of tradition, Mason. I think what unites those differing tributaries is opposition to capital, opposition to empire, and a deep accent on what human beings can do when we associate power and world making together.
mm. One of the things that I've appreciated in the little bit that I've read from Black radicals is that it's not just the melanin in the skin, right? It is blackness is seen as a political project. It's a there's a social constructedness of blackness, and they sort of think of blackness in that way. And I'm curious, like maybe you have some additional thoughts on like what does the blackness in or what is black in black radical tradition? What does that really mean? It's because again, from kind of at least my interpretation of a lot of these authors is it's not just simply the fact that these are authors who are black racially, but they think about blackness differently than just simply by like how much melanin or how we would categorize somebody just racially. I'm curious, maybe you have additional thoughts. I don't know if there's really a specific question there, but I'm really curious like what your thoughts are around thinking around blackness as like maybe a political project or how black radicals would think about blackness.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So I think there are a number of ways to get at it. In Robinson's text, he begins his exposition of Black radicalism looking at folks like Richard Wright, the famed novelist, W.E.B. Du Bois, and also Trinidadian intellectual C.L.R. James. Um, we could throw in there also, and then I'll get to the question of summary. I mentioned Claudia Vera Jones earlier, who notably has a critique of racism, patriarchy, and class exploitation that predates Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of
Mm,
intersectionality by
right.
3 decades. And this is the point
Wow.
that Sharice Burton Steadley, a political scientist and herself a socialist, puts forth. And I think a part of what Black is doing is not only a sense of counter imperial, anti capitalist imagination. I think there's a deep sense of diasporic connection. Some folks have
Mm,
talked about connections across the Atlantic. I think there's a sense of imagined solidarity that cuts across nation state borders um, that I think is important. The second thing that I think Blank is doing is there's also a kind of an aesthetic dimension. Fred Moten um, has a book on the Black radical tradition that comes at this question through the arts, through cinema, that talks about Blackness as kind of, I'm paraphrasing, hopefully responsibly, as kind of an interruption into how we envision what it means to be human, how we think
mm,
of joy, how we think of the beautiful. So it's not only a political and social project, but reimagining what is value, what is beautiful, what does joy look like, who determines that, what are the regimes of the fantastic that guide and inspire us to get involved in work of justice. It's not just obligation talk, it's how do we demand and design the world that we, and now I'm drawing on Christian language, pray for,
mm,
desire, want to iterate into being.
right.
Black does
And
that
that
as well.
And that way of thinking about blackness is part of the reason why we would see someone like James Cone call Jesus black, right?
$100%.
Obviously Cone is not trying to make this argument that was Jesus racially black or not. Like that's not the point. The point is that Cone, being a part of this black radical tradition, is thinking about blackness in this really kind of constructed political way, where it is a political imagination of the kind of future that we want to see in the world. And so his identification of Jesus being black is less about, again, Jesus being racially black, and more about that Jesus is one who has experienced what it's like to be black, and also Jesus being one that is envisioning a world that is the world that we see black radicals also trying to envision.
That's right. That's right. And while I'm not sure Cone would necessarily, I would have identified as being a part of the Black radical tradition, I think in many ways he embodies the best of
Totally.
it for sure. And the only thing I'd add there, Mason, is that Cone's Christological move to identify Jesus as Black points to Jesus in one sense as being oppressed. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, and
Hmm.
all the rest. But there's also the sense in which Jesus is Black and tapping into the aesthetic register of the Psalms, of being
Mm.
able to um, go to temple and have moments of worship. And in that regard, when we see a Cone writing on the spirituals and the blues, there's a deep sense of music and the aesthetic that goes along with the liberation. I think it's important to keep those two together, Mason. And the reason
Mm.
I'll name that is because sometimes freedom and justice talk by folks of faith or by folks of ethical concern is so heavy on the must and the should and the ought, but the
Mm.
why and the captivation
Yeah.
is it's sometimes a little airy.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good point, and I want to put a bookmark in that, because I think later on I really want to dive into why specifically I think religion needs to be a part of these kind of political movements, these left political movements, because I think religion has a good why. Whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism, but I think religions have good whys. So we can dive into that a little later, but.
Yeah.
So we've talked kind of generally around the Black radical tradition, and obviously, then your book really focuses in on the Black Christian socialist tradition. So can you talk a little bit more, maybe specifically around the history of this tradition? Again, knowing that many of my listeners are either ex-Christian people or people trying to navigate thinking about Christianity differently than what white evangelicalism maybe offered. A lot of these folks, including myself growing up, would have had no idea that there were, well, I mean, they might have known that there were black Christians, but that you could be black, socialist, and Christian, like all those three things combined, just never would have made sense for a lot of people. So it would just be great to learn more about what that history of that tradition is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the deconstruction and piecing together architecture of faith that makes sense of who we are, who we want to be in the world, and what we take the divine to be has parallels.
Mm,
Though I didn't grow up in the white evangelical tradition, I try to read deeply and broadly across Christian traditions. And, people radicalize or expand borders over time. There's of course, Southern Baptist and Grand Rapids wing of the white evangelical tradition. But we also can't forget folks like your Brian McLarens and your
mm-hmm,
Rachel Held Evans, folks who
mm-hmm,
have poked against that tradition and perhaps in McLaren's case, grown beyond it while carrying
yep,
some of the best of it. In the context of Black Christian socialism, I think you see similar journeys that folks take. For
mm,
instance, Reverend D. Ransom uh, pastored in Chicago at the dawn of industrial capitalism. And he is someone who, a few years into his ministry, we see in 1896, Mason, he's writing about socialism in not um, the Appeal, which is a popular socialist newspaper, not in um, other journals and pamphlets of the day, in the AME Church Review, which is a
wow,
denominational
mm-hmm,
journal. He's writing about socialism. You also see Theodore Holly in that same Church Review, Mason, who's writing about socialism and how the evils of industrial capitalism can be constrained not only through political and social means, but through a theological interpretation of Christ and of the church and of what church people should be doing that has a
mm-hmm,
deep ethical accent. And so I
mm-hmm,
think those two individuals in part are fountains of the tradition. Um, I would also point to those who may not identify as socialists, but who have a deep anti-capitalism in their project. And a part of what I try to do in Plain Good Room is to lift up womanists like Katie Cannon,
mm-hmm,
who at the end of Womanism and the Soul of Community has a chapter on caste, on class, and race, where she's talking about how colonialism and empire combine with capitalism's acquisitive instinct to not only disfigure our labor, but to disfigure our desire in some ways.
mm.
So just wanted to name a few just kind of high points of the tradition. In terms of my own testimony, if I can, Mason, is
Yes,
that all right?
absolutely.
Um, I grew up in Atlanta, and Atlanta for me was the introduction to a kind of Black social gospel tradition, though I wouldn't have called it that at the time. And for me, my pastor, I grew up at Zion Hill Baptist Church. He would always talk about living to love and loving to serve. And so, this idea that love as a religious and ethical theme is the motif that floods and permeates any kind of legitimate God talk, was just
Mm,
baked into my pores from the beginning. And I
mm,
don't think I became conscious of it until later. When I got to seminary, I recognized that love needs liberation in order to not be maudlin, in order to not be mystifying, pacifying, um, should be distrusted kind of talk. If there's talk of love and not freedom, then I think we are asking people to become accommodated to their own subjugation, which I don't think something Jesus would ask for, would be pleased with. And it's certainly not something any human being, I think, when we sit with ourselves, long enough in introspection, really want to see.
mm-hmm,
Um, the last thing I'll note, along with love, and along with liberation. I'm a Baptist preacher, so I think in alliteration, letters,
Mm,
the letters of
mm,
Cornel West really have been a balm throughout the years. And he is one of the first persons in the late 20th century to really talk about Christian socialism explicitly.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
in the Witness magazine, which is an Episcopal Church publication in the 80s, he's talking about Christian socialism. And at my alma mater, this may be an interesting factoid for those viewing and watching. Cornel West, who before Race Matters, which is the book most people know him for in 1994, in 1980, Mason, he gave a speech at Princeton Theological Seminary called A Christian Defense of Democratic Socialism. Uh,
wow.
and so, chapter four, in some ways, is situating Cornel West, Amaria Armstrong, who I think also, in some ways, sits within a, if not a Black Christian socialist tradition, what I would call a kind of anointed assembly of anti-capitalist uh,
Mhm,
and womanists who are trying to essentially think through the question: if the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the people and all they that dwell therein, if the UN Declaration of Human Rights or something like it is true, why then do we have talk about beloved community that acts as though we can make beloved community real in
mm,
a capitalist socio-political arrangement?
mm, mm,
That contradictions when we have to sort out through our
mhm,
politics.
mhm. As you're naming people like Cornel West, I'm looking back or thinking back to growing up, again, very conservative white
Yeah, yeah,
evangelicalism, and I do remember hearing people like Cornel West every now and then, and then now that I'm remembering this, I remember being in middle school when Obama was elected,
yeah,
and that would have been around the time that the video came out of Reverend Jeremiah Wright and
yeah,
his God Damn America speech, or sermon. And I still remember, just as a conservative middle schooler, just being enraged that a supposed preacher would be, damning America. And then now later on, I'm realizing like, oh, these are like some people that have been villainized in white evangelicalism, at least the white evangelicalism I had grown up in. Someone
yeah,
like Cornel West or Reverend Jeremiah Wright were people that were villainized, and now I'm
yeah,
realizing, oh, they've just been a part of the Black radical tradition for many years,
yeah.
and so it's just really interesting that like my introduction to the Black radical tradition, or at least specifically with those who were Christians, were villains. They were thought of as villains, and
Mm,
it's like now I see these people as prophets, and so it's really interesting like how much of a change has happened in my life that I go from recognizing some of those names when I was 14 years old and thinking of them as villains to now being almost 30 years old and realizing, oh, these were people who
yeah.
were prophets of our day.
And can I hop in?
Yes.
There's a American Christian pastime to villainize, otherize, and dismiss people who introduce dissonance to our theological scheme. I think that's true with Reverend Jeremiah Wright. It's true with Cornel West. It's true with how folks have villainized the work of so many different folks. We could talk about a Dr. Ebony Marshall Turman. We could talk about a Dr. Carrie Day and the powerful work they're doing helping us reimagine the incarnation, and particularly in Dr. Day's case, who's been making a strong anti-capitalist critique from the very beginning of her corpus. Um, but I think about a Rob Bell, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who, as soon as Love Wins comes out, we get, I think it was Piper who, writes a little goodbye
Yep.
Rob
Yep.
Bell tweet.
Farewell, Rob Bell.
Farewell, Rob Bell. It's as though one tweet can just banish someone's theological claims and humanity from existence, and we don't have to deal with the arguments and the research that have been put on the
Mm-hmm.
table. So this kind of impulse to be carceral and confine and to villainize, I think we unfortunately see it across the board. Rather than, why not have a plenty good room and generously understood sense of a theological or political commons where we can debate and deliberate about the kind of world we each believe we all deserve.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to dive into the theology that maybe animates your particular Black Christian socialism, or maybe you want to field this question thinking more broadly of
Sure.
the entirety of the Black Christian socialist tradition. But yeah, I'd love to just know some of the theology behind this tradition that just really animates it, that really makes it move and have its have its being in this world.
Hey, I hear canonical allusions when they are being invoked.
Trying my
So
best. Trying my best.
thank you, Mason. I'll speak for myself. I certainly can speak in terms of impressions of the tradition based on my kind of training as a political scientist and pastor. But for me, I'll start biblically and then maybe broaden beyond there. For me, I think everyone who is walking a kind of Christian or any philosophical or ideological path has to figure out like where do you cast your bucket down to
Yeah.
try to have a sense of like what and I love the way you put it, animates you. For me, um it's really three parts of the biblical traditions, plural, I'll say. One is Luke 4:18, which is really kind of a
Hmm.
go-to passage of 18 and 19 of the Black social gospel and Black radical tradition. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, preaching good news to the poor, setting captives free, binding up the brokenhearted, which you hear a little bit more in Isaiah 61, and announcing the acceptable year of the Lord's favor, which is, of course, a throwback to Leviticus and debt cancellation, and a sense of property relations and what we would regard now, many centuries later, contractual relations, not quite the same way in the text. We can be honest about that, but interpret it for our moment, a sense that title and contracts and individuated claims to private property are apparently not regarded as perennial, permanent, and inviolable in the
Yep.
text. And so, in our moment, that stands to me, that Luke 14, Leviticus, Isaiah 61 moment, as Jesus being someone who is, in Karl Barth's language, a partisan of the poor, because
Mm.
Christ himself was poor, was unhoused, experienced insecure refugee conditions, was not a citizen, as Howard Thurman points out in Jesus and the Disinherited. And as Thurman also points out, I allude to this a bit in my book, Plenty Good Room, is a kind of labor union leader. Um,
Mm.
Jesus gets the disciples together, right? They walk off their jobs, they pledge their intelligence, their talent, their labor to creating this kind of evolving union and communion of saints that want to turn the world upside down and
Hmm.
create moments of health that's experienced together, and the miracle of sharing food together, which is a kind of proto cooperative approach, the common purse, which again is a sense of pooling together what each of us have so that us can have more than might be individually held.
Hmm.
But the other thing, Mason, in addition to passages, I don't think that Bible thumping is an inherently bad thing if we acknowledge the situatedness of our claims, um, and do it as a point of inspiration rather than like bludgeoning people over the head. Um, James 5's push against wage theft for me is a point of inspiration. And shout out to um, folks at the Magnificast who have been making that point for years. And then, of course, Acts 2 and 4, Mason, which speak as the um, communist Rosa Luxemburg has long noted, in a kind of proto socialist, consumer driven cooperative sense, in terms
Hmm.
of all things being held in common and pooling together resources. But on just a human level, Mason, if I may, of course, the Bible is something that blends the divine and human. But by human, I mean, on a more personal note, Mason, um, what really drives my sense of Black Christian socialism um, is a story that I have been sharing as I talk about Plenty Good Room. The first eulogy and funeral I did, Mason, was for a young adult in a church here in New York City where I was pastoring. And he died, I came to find out, because there was a chronic illness he was enduring, and there was a healthcare operation that he needed to have done that he didn't have the insurance nor the discretionary household resources to afford
Mm,
that treatment. And I believed then, believe now, that he died not because God called him home, but because a racial capitalist system sent him home.
mm,
And my commitment to a kind of faith filled First Amendment socialism recognizes that we live in a casket conferring society where poverty is the fourth cause of death in the country. And so many people are experiencing impoverished lives and premature death because they're being deprived of
mm-hmm,
things that God would intend for them to have, and that in our best moments, people intend to confer upon one another.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've seen, I don't know the exact statistics, but I've seen something along the lines of like tens of thousands of Americans every year die simply because
Yeah,
they aren't able to access healthcare because they don't have the resources for it. And and there are so many countries in the world where that is simply not a reality because they've
yeah,
created those countries have created systems where everyone is going to get healthcare. And it's just it blows my mind that we every year experience tens of thousands of people dying simply because of this, and other countries have chosen not to experience that, and have
that's all.
created a world where that isn't a reality in their country, and it just blows my mind. It blows my mind that that's a thing.
Yeah, it does. And I believe citation ministry is helpful in case folks are wondering, where you make that up, Reverend? Did you just pull that out of thin air? The Yale School of Public Health, among others, has found that poverty is the fourth leading social determinant of death, is the way that
Wow.
it would be put.
Yeah. You mentioned Acts 2 just a bit ago. And you also mentioned the Magnificast. I had Matt and Dean on my podcast a couple years ago, and something that Dean said that has just still stuck with me is that, and it relates to Acts 2.
Yeah,
He talked about how the first followers of Jesus, right? Like they experience this Jesus, they live with him, they spend their time with him, and he dies, right? And all of a sudden, if you were one of those followers, you're probably thinking, well, this is over. I mean, guess guess that's a done. Now I'm gonna go back to go fishing or something, I guess, right? So this like whole, this thing where it's just you feel like you're a part of something, and all of a
yeah,
sudden it feels like it's over. And then he comes back, right? You get the risen Christ, and it's just this pure elation. Like it's not over. It's not over. There is hope. This person that we've been following around for the last 3 years, he's still alive. He's still here. And then you get this, and this is what Dean said was, okay, so there was this whole Jesus story that these people experienced. They experienced this Jesus, and their first response to experiencing this transformative power of Jesus is to share everything together. Like
yeah,
that is their first response, is to share everything they have in common. And I'm like that transformation that they experienced in Jesus is the same exact kind of transformation we can experience in 2024. And
yeah.
if we really, I really truly believe that we experience that transformative power in Jesus in 2024, that can still be our response to that transformative power, is that we also share everything that we have in common. And so that's like what gets me going every day. Like, this is why I'm still a Christian. This is why I still want to be a part of Christianity. This is why I still love Jesus, is because the very first followers of Jesus, their first response in having this transformative experience with Jesus is to share everything in common. And that's the same exact Jesus that can transform our lives today.
Absolutely. That's a powerful altar call. And since you got us in the text, and Luke Acts is connected, I'd be remiss if I didn't turn here and in some ways try to talk about this a bit in Playing a Good Room. I think it's important precisely because some religious progressive, some ethically left traditions do not invoke um, a gender expansive kind of politics to link the radicalism that we source and see in Jesus and see in Acts. with Mary's Magnificat in Luke 1, which
Mm.
is deeply drawn on in liberation theology traditions in Peru, in Brazil, to pick a few places, El Salvador, thinking of Romero there. But when in the Magnificat, Luke chapter 1, 46 through 51 or 52 ish, we get um, the hungry being filled with good things, the rich being sent away empty, the mighty pulled down from their thrones, and the humble exalted. Like this is language of upheaval, of social reversal. This is language if the mighty are dethroned and the humble are exalted. When we infer and deal with the raw materials of what the text symbolizes, I think that gestures us towards a deep sense of participation, and everyone can experience this elation and exalting together. And so I think it's important to always have a sense that Jesus gets it from his mama, is the way I like to put it. That, that he doesn't just arrive at this tabula rasa, but Jesus is always storing and traditioning from a rich heritage, which also helps us to avoid the kind of somewhat supersessionist move that sometimes Christians get into as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Jesus was shaking what his mama gave him, right?
That's right. That's right. Shaking systems of power
That's
and
right.
shaking stories in subversive ways. That's right.
So a little bit ago, and this is where the bookmark comes back. We talked a little bit just for a second about how in a lot of the left movements that we find ourselves, there seems to be this aversion or skepticism of religion, and I think it's absolutely imperative that Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, doesn't matter who you are, that if you have these religious convictions, then you need to let that animate the way that you think about this different world that we think can be possible. I think it's just
Yeah.
absolutely imperative. So can you talk a little bit about how, what you think religion, or maybe specifically Christianity, can offer
Yeah.
to these revolutionary movements that are so important, and needed to happen?
Yeah, really appreciate that. So I'll get at the question this way. Um, in some ways, the theoretical heart of Playing a Good Room is the third chapter, which is called Repairing Our Democracy. And I
Mm-hmm.
talk about how when we have a representative democracy where essentially congressional seats, Senate seats, we could walk down to mayors and walk up to presidents, are often bought and sold by independent expenditures, super PACs, and those who are glad to exploit what Citizens United, that Supreme Court decision has opened up in terms of
Mm-hmm.
just wild west of campaign finance. That's created a space where those who are deploying political authority and power do not really represent the will of the least affluent and the least connected citizens. And so, if
Mm.
representative democracy is a sham and a shame, where then do we turn? I argue in brief that we need reparative democracy, participatory democracy, and economic democracy.
Mm.
Economic democracy, I think the traditions of James, of Acts, of Luke, as we just talked about, gives us some resources there. I think in terms of the tradition of reparative democracy and redressing grievances, which, by the way, the Constitution says that we have the right to petition the government for the redress of our grievances. It's important to ground that for those who for whom a civic citation is helpful. But the story of Zacchaeus, right, who experiences salvation and wants to pay back fourfold everything that has been um, unjustly swindled, is the term I'll use, from Zacchaeus's compatriots. And then in terms of participatory democracy, I'm citing a few scriptures, but then I'll make the point in a different way. I've always been inspired, Mason, by a passage in First Corinthians when Paul is trying to establish this is the best of Paul. I should hasten to note, because there are many dimensions of Paul, but the best of Paul, in the 12th chapter, he talks about the Spirit kind of indwells us all, and we each have a manifestation of the Spirit to contribute to the common good. The sense
Mm.
that we don't have to be romanced by those who are particularly eloquent or
Mm-hmm.
especially charismatic, but each of us has an innate right plus inherent abilities that we can deploy to contribute to this different world, to abolish some things and to establish other things, to tear down some things and to plant other things. And so this field of metaphor, of mystery, and of messaging that Christian traditions can provide, I think is a huge resource of inspiration, of motivation, of counter narrative, of believing in what is plausible and possible, and can be rendered probable if we have a sense of emotion that is something we share together, that undergirds our self-determination to act rather than
Mm,
just to orate, or solely to post, or solely to critique. I think religion at its best binds us together in an
mhm,
interdependent project of doing what some have called solidarity economics.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think I've heard Brian McLaren say this, that religion. I think the etymology of it is that, like, sort of, it's like a realignment. It's
That's right.
and I forget exactly what where the root word comes from. I'm sure it's Latin, but yeah, it's like this realignment. So religion, really at the heart of it, even the word is us coming together, working together
Yeah.
for good.
That's right.
Um,
At its
yeah.
best, because we you and I
Yes.
both
Oh
know
yeah.
that there are experiences and formations of Christianity that have poured holy water on hierarchy
Hmm.
and prejudice and the acquisitive instinct of capitalism, to draw on Dr. Katie Cannon's language. And I think being honest about that ghastly history of Christianity is a way of, one, just being candid, but also two, I think it helps to form relationships of trust when it's not only narrating the best case scenario, but we're willing to be held accountable for the worst case scenario, rather than saying that Christianity is not my Christianity. It's like, well, wait, y'all are drawing on a kind of a shared pool of inheritance and traditions. And if you're going to pull for the good, you've also got to be willing to be pulled into a difficult conversation,
Hmm.
for the bad, I think, as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think we can just look historically even at
That's
some
right.
of the revolutionary moments that have happened,
Of course.
especially over the last number of centuries, and the all of those movements, or many of those movements, core to those movements were religious leaders, people that could speak to those who are religious in their particular
Sure.
context, and animate and lead those religious adherents to saying, you know what, a better world is possible, and this is what we're going to do to make that world possible. And I am just, it's hard to find too many revolutionary movements that have happened over the last number of centuries where religion, or a certain kind of religion, wasn't core to it. I mean, we even maybe most recently would see that with the civil rights movement. I mean, we have obviously MLK being, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. maybe being the most well known, but you even have someone like Malcolm X, a devout Muslim, right?
That's right.
Uh, and so religion has been so core to many of these revolutionary moments and movements in at least our more recent history.
That's right. And just to kind of call the roll quickly, if we may, we could think of uh, a partial list of the roll, but a roll. I think of Julius Nyerere, a Catholic brother who led the post-colonial movement in Tanzania, and whose Arusha Declaration is called on directly by James Cone to inspire his move towards not just cultural liberation, but a sense of political and economic liberation. Reverend Addie Wyatt, who is a pastor in Chicago and helped to raise money through her union local to fund the Montgomery bus boycott, is
Mm,
someone else who comes to mind. Um, and we could talk at length about um, some of the revolutionary work and movement, whether it's from the labor movement here in the US, whether we're thinking of um, Romero and base communities in El Salvador and in Brazil, in particular, comes to mind. So yeah, I think there's a rich history of social movements, labor movements, party involvement and church engagement, is how I put it, that speaks to the potentially constructive, and within that potentially constructive, Mason, I'd say sometimes radical, instinct of Christian engagement.
Right. I mean, I think a church, even though obviously there's been a lot of church decline over recent decades, churches still seem to be a really powerful way if you want to organize people and get something done. Churches are a great way to make that happen since you already have this core group of people. Maybe it's 100 people, maybe it's 1,000 people, depending on the size of a church. But you got a core
Yeah,
group of people who know each other. They know each other's strengths. They know each other's weaknesses, and they can get together and make something happen. And there's not a lot of spaces in at least in America now where you can get that many people that might know
yeah,
each other and get them driven towards a common goal. You just don't see a lot of spaces in America to do that, and churches still are one of those spaces that can be
yeah,
done. And we see obviously conservative and more conservative Christian communities do that very thing, and they've been able to organize their people around that. But that's
yeah.
not to say that more progressive communities can't do the same thing.
That's fine. One of the things which also inspires some of the writing of the book in some ways. I'm glad to be the co-chair, Mason, of the Institute for Christian Socialism, which is a
Great,
group.
great people over there, by the way.
Thank you so much. A part of what we're trying to do is live into that, um, the best and most beautiful edge of possibility of what Christianity can be, as distinct from what it sometimes is and oftentimes has been.
hmm What would you say are ways that people can participate in this Christian or Black socialism? What are ways that that maybe the everyday person, maybe it's maybe somebody's listening right now and they're a stay-at-home dad or a stay-at-home mom, or maybe they're an accountant or a teacher or a veterinarian or whatever they are, right? Like, what can that person do to participate in a different world that we're talking about and imagining?
I love that question. And I think a well crafted question, is so often the prompt for deep mutual understanding. So, first, bless
hmm
you for the question,
Oh,
Mason.
thank you.
Um, One way that folks have long been participating in, building what I call a plain and good room society and this different world we're talking about is there's a long legacy of Black churches that have created credit unions so that their money could be pooled together of laity, of clergy, and folks in the neighborhood who may not be members of the church, but who are community members and who
hmm
deserve to have a financial institution that is non-predatory, that doesn't charge you through the nose in order for you to have access to money you may need to buy a home or to make rent or to purchase diapers. So credit unions are one example, both participating in them and the scores of congregations that have started them, sometimes on an interfaith basis. The second example I'd lift up are the frustration that often comes from gentrification in many of our metro areas and rural communities, and the move to push for and establish community land trusts and to
hmm
have public banks that can resource community land trusts. We have at least seven, maybe eight in New York City. I know there are a number of them in Chicago. There's a public bank in North Dakota. It's worth noting. So this is not
Wow.
just in kind
Right.
of,
Yeah, in
quote
urban
unquote,
places.
yeah, in blue places in particular, democratic places.
Right,
You
right.
see it, across the board. So those are a few ways, participating in and helping to build, instruments that are not magic bullets, but that if we build enough of them, we can start to destabilize profit centered, exclusive financial arrangements and begin to build some of the seedlings of a different society. So those are a
hmm
few things I lift up.
Wow, that's great. And I've even had conversations with folks on here talking about just the everyday little practices that, that might not be socialism in its entirety, but it gets us a little closer to
Yeah.
a better world. And, whether that's, growing something in your garden and you just end up with way too many tomatoes and you're like, hey neighbor, you want some tomatoes, and maybe that neighbor is really gifted at a different thing and they end up having too many strawberries, and now all of a sudden you're just exchanging out of love for one another.
Yeah,
Because obviously, again, at the end of the day, um, this world that we're imagining is predicated on believing that there is abundance,
that's right.
right? And
That's right.
so, if we, as long as we live into this mindset that there is abundance, then we can just freely give, and freely exchange with one another out of love, not out of obligation, or not out of ulterior motives around trying to be greedy. It's all about love for one another, and so there's even little everyday practices like that that just start to break that kingdom of God a little bit more into this world.
Absolutely. I think those are important steps, and they help to curate a way of being within ourselves and a way of being with each other that helps to bring that kind of kingdom, as Ada Maria Diaz puts it, just a little bit closer. The other thing I note on this point that I think is worth lifting up, particularly in light of, I think, ambivalence that many people experience regardless of their politics. Um, and that ambivalence is, what do we do with the fact that it's hard to get from however we would characterize now to however we would characterize where we want to be. And that's my way of
Mm,
just kind of generously naming that the discontent with current conditions of wealth inequality and the domination system, as New Testament scholar Walter Wink used to put it a generation or two ago, and trying to get to the utopia or Canaan or um, place where, as Revelation puts it, the tree is stretched for the healing of nations, right? The kind of um, place we may imagine. I think there is a way of envisioning the disruptive and the stage setting role that law, public policy, direct action, mutual aid along the lines that you're calling us to plays. Um, and I say it's important to note that because there's a concern among some that, if we focus on the law, elections, public policy, direct action, and don't do um, explicitly always and everywhere like sharp edged ideological work, are we like compromising or somehow
mm,
like missing the boat? And I think that there's something to be said about focusing on, and here I'm drawing on Gayrod Wilmore, not only on liberation, but we need to be concerned while having an eye towards liberation on helping people to survive
yeah.
and helping with the question of elevation so that I'm not always fighting to keep, the heat on and the lights on with my landlord and not always fighting to just have enough edges in the day where I can rest and collapse and rejuvenate. I'm like those concerns matter right here, the quotidian ones, just as much as whatever it is we're trying to build, if that makes sense. And I think
Hmm.
a part of how we can blend the kind of small is beautiful approach to relying on Herculean voluntary efforts while we're trying to get to this bigger, better thing is to have a kind of a vanguard sort of approach to how we use the law, public policy, elections, and the like to help us bridge as swiftly, as ethically as possible towards the world that we're demanding and dreaming and desiring about.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, and this isn't just even politically, it can happen theologically, but yeah, there's these sort of steps that people a lot
That's
of
right.
times take, whether it's politically, for a goal, or maybe it's a theological journey. There's these steps, and
Please. Yeah.
sometimes it seems like as we're taking these steps, some people sort of stop, right? and a-
That's
and
right.
then and then there's people that have influenced them to get to that point, and then they stop, right? And I
Yeah.
see all the times, like, people, maybe on more on the left or whatever, where they're just like, you can't just stop right there, right? And I think there's like a level of truth to that, but also, that's not to dismiss the steps that it's taking for
That's
that
right.
person to get there. Now, I think it's important for us to not stop. I think it's important for us to continue,
100%.
that we've got there's greater theological imagination, there's greater political imagination that we can have. So it's important not to stop, but also we got to recognize for some people they're coming from different places, and they're going to take a certain journey, and it might take them a little while. But guess
Yeah.
what? It can happen. It can happen. I like I mentioned before, when I was 14 years old, I was the most conservative South Dakota kid that you would have ever imagined, right? And here I
Mm,
am now, a socialist, anarchist, all the things, right? Like all the things that would scare my parents. Like, and that all happened within a matter of a decade. Like, if I could change, anyone can change. And so that's
that's right.
where, like, my hope is that, I know how powerful it was to actually truly experience the transformative power of Jesus. And I know that if that can
Bear
change
witness,
me,
Mason.
then right, if that can change me, it can change any one of us, right?
Yeah.
And so it might take time, it might take certain steps, and hopefully people don't just stop in the middle of that road. Or in the middle of that journey. But I know it's possible. I know it's possible, and I'm not going to give up hope on those folks. And also, I still think let's keep pushing them along. Let's keep prodding them along.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, loving them will bring them to hopefully ultimately is where the kingdom of God breaks through into this world.
That's right. And I appreciate how among the different stories and traditions and methods of analysis that you're um, definitely deploying. And by the way, I deeply enjoyed the Jesus and the anarchist conversation that you all had
Oh
on the
yeah,
People's
Terry's just
Theology.
the best.
Yeah. Yes, and amen, and also the questions that you pose were rich ones. But I think there's something, and to your point about the steps and the stages of our journey not having to stop. For me, I feel a bit of a testimony thread happening throughout this conversation.
Right,
I value and take great joy in the tradition of metanoia and continually growing and
right. You even
experiencing.
talked about that right away in the beginning of the book.
That's right. That's right. Of our minds being renewed and expanded through reasoning together, through deliberation. There's something that's deeply Jesus, that's deeply joyful, that's deeply um, expansive about not only wanting to be free from capitalism, but free from heteropatriarchy. And not only free from heteropatriarchy, but free from notions of ability and competency. And I'll even make a different kind of turn than some are making. The debate which happened um, yesterday, which is June 27th, folks are making the dangerous equation that how one speaks or one stumbles to speak may be a reflection of one's competency or ability. We can bracket Biden from that. What does that mean for people who are multilingual learners, or for people who
Hmm.
are neurodivergent, or for people who, um, may not communicate in quite the same way? Does that mean that we don't trust them to lead a committee? That we don't trust them to do the community free? It's like a part of continual growth and continual consciousness raising and being grateful for those who've raised our conscience, I think, Mason, is this mutuality of metanoia. It's not only them that need to keep growing, us too, right? Need to
Hmm.
keep growing.
Hmm. Absolutely, without a doubt. Well, last couple questions. How do you hope Plenty Good Room inspires and liberates its readers? Maybe it might be obvious, but yeah, I'd love to hear from your your thoughts around that.
Yeah, really appreciate that question. And again, just thank you, Mason, for this rich conversation. Um, the epilogue of the book is a section that's called "Praying Without Ceasing," and there's a poem that I'll read that I think, if I may, it's a
Of
brief
course.
poem that speaks to the heart and spirit of the book and the poetry and praxis that I hope it embodies. Poem is called "Try Anyhow." Racial justice is a worthwhile ideal, but unworkable in America or any other nation state, according to some. Socialism is a beautiful dream, but impossible to realize, according to some. Ending patriarchy in our generation is a deeply ethical goal, but unable to be dragged into today, according to some. Perhaps they are right, but so is the dream. For the
Mm,
sake of its embodiment, for our elders, children, and those in between, let us try anyhow and see what the end is going to be.
Mm, mm. That reminds me of the late Rachel Held Evans had a quote where she said something along the lines of, "The story of Jesus is a story I'm willing to risk being wrong about," and socialism is something I'm willing to risk being wrong about. Ending that patriarchy is something I'm willing to risk being wrong about. Right? Those sort of things where we might be wrong, but I think it's worth the risk.
That's right. The prospect of being right about the nexus of Jesus and all of those things, ending capitalism, ending patriarchy, ending regimes of racial injustice. Even if it doesn't work out, I'm placing all my chips on the radical Jesus train, and let's see where
Hmm.
this thing ends up historically.
I'll be on that journey with you. I'll put all my chips in as well. I'm
A
all
joy to
in.
be with you, Mason.
Lovely, lovely. Last question here. How can listeners get connected to you and your work, and where should they get the book?
Yeah, really appreciate that question. So my socials on Instagram, X, Twitter, Instagram threads, what have you, is Andrew J. Wilkes, Wilkes, Andrew J. Wilkes. Plenty good room. Had its birthday in the world
Yes,
Tuesday, June 25th. So it's fresh out there, and folks can get it in paperback, ebook, and audiobook wherever books are sold. From Broadleaf Books, it's available Target, Amazon, community bookstores, wherever you decide to do your book purchasing.
love it, love it. Great. Well, you know what? It was so great to finally meet and chat. I've been looking forward to
Same.
this since we got it scheduled. So thank you so much for chatting more about the book, and hopefully it inspires and liberates some folks that read it.
Thanks so much, Mason. That's indeed the hope, the prayer, and all that good